Hi everyone, welcome. Welcome to Seizing the Moment, Advancing the Fossil Fuel Treaty in Santa Marta. Very, very happy to see everyone here. If you want to put in the chat where you're coming from, and your name and your organization, please feel free to. We also have interpretation for this webinar, and the instructions are in the next slide, which we'll show soon. Maybe we can show the next slide so that we can show people how to access interpretation. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome, everyone. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Seizing the Moment, Advancing the Fossil Fuel Treaty in Santa Marta. We will have interpretations for this webinar. We're very excited to see you. There should be instructions both on the screen and in the chat on how to access the interpretation. Feel free to also message in the chat your name, your organization, where you're calling in from. Welcome, everyone. So excited to have everyone here. Such an important time for the network to come together. We're still seeing some of the participants entering the Zoom slowly, so we'll wait a little bit to also allow people to arrive and turn on the interpretation. Thank you for being here, everyone. Yes, you can feel free to add your org to your name. You can also introduce yourself in the chat, um, where you're calling in from, um, your organization, your name. It's so nice to see the entire network here together. Not the entire network, but a lot of us in the network here together as we gear up for the conference that's coming up in just a week, in 2 weeks, very soon. Um, All right. I hope everyone has fixed their interpretation, and maybe we can go to the next slide to really frame what we're doing here today. Again, as we've been saying, welcome to the Seizing the Moment, Advancing the Fossil Fuel Treaty in Santa Marta. As many of us, or we all probably know, we're having the first international conference on the transition away from fossil fuels at the end of April. Woohoo! It's a big, big moment, and global leaders, civil society organizations, and frontline communities will convene in Santa Marta, Colombia for the very first conference against a backdrop of imperialist aggression in Latin America and West Asia, which we cannot look away from. And the latter of the imperialist aggression in West Asia has really created a great shock to the oil and gas supply since the 1970s, and which is now spilling out to wreak havoc not only on fossil fuels but on all supply chains. This moment, therefore, really represents a critical inflection point in global climate politics where narratives, priorities, and alliances around fossil fuel phase out will be contested and shaped. And so, how do we actually take advantage and make the most out of this conference? That's what we'll be talking about today. How do we have a strong political signal to initiate negotiation of a fossil fuel treaty? How do we shift dialogue on equitable international cooperation on fossil fuel supply? How do we again strengthen the momentum behind the fossil fuel treaty at this conference and beyond? And how do we ensure that there's substantial participation of non-state actors in the conference? So today we'll be talking about the information regarding the conference, its structure, participation modalities, and parallel events. It has been really complex and fragmented and difficult to navigate, we know this. But at the same time, many allies within the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative Network are seeking clarity on how to engage strategically and meaningfully. And so this webinar is here to address that gap by providing political orientation, practical guidance, and strategic alignment ahead of the conference. I hope you're all very, very excited. Um, Next slide, I would like to introduce our amazing speakers. First, we'll have Catalina Caro, who's the coordinator of Sensat Agua Viva, or Friends of the Earth Colombia. Kata is an environmentalist and feminist anthropologist with a master's in geography from the National University of Colombia, where she forms part of the Cultural and Environmental Research Group within the Geography Department. She has investigated themes related to human rights among indigenous peoples in the Colombian Southwest and Caribbean, as well as socio-environmental conflicts related to mining, as well as intercultural education. And then we will have Alex Rafalovich, director of the Fossil Fuel Treaty, who has worked as a policy analyst, campaigner, organizer, and strategist for climate justice for 15 years, including with the global campaign to demand climate justice, Climate Action Network, 350.org. And he has worked on digital and electoral campaigns across the Americas, Europe, and Australia, and has a first-class honors degree in law from the Australian National University and master's in economics from the Indira Gandhi Institute for Development Research, and he lives in Bogota, Colombia, with his family. And last but not least, we have Andres Gomez, who is head of Latin American campaigns of the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative. He's an energy and climate justice activist, and he is an environmentalist, petroleum engineer, and researcher in fossil fuels, climate, post-petroleum societies, and environmental transitions. And he has participated in many discussion processes and national and international publications on the exploitation of unconventional oil fields, fracking, and post-oil transitions. He's also a member of the Fracking-Free Colombian Alliance. I also forgot to introduce myself. Hi, everyone. I'm Mitzi Jonel Tan. I'm a climate justice activist from the Philippines, and very, very excited to be having this webinar with everyone as we gear up for the upcoming conference. And without further ado, I send it off to Kata.
Hi, greetings all. It's a joy for me and for Sensat to be here, to be participating in this space. We want to thank the treaty for the invitation. And what I'm supposed to talk about is a little analysis as to why this conference is going to be held in Colombia, specifically in Santa Marta, and what is the special context that makes a country like Colombia the center or the core of the debate of phasing out of fossil fuels. And I would like to start my presentation saying that Colombia is in the last months of a progressive government. I think this is the first progressive government in our country. And in this process, we have seen the difficulties and the challenges of holding a government like this. This was not easy. It was the manifestation of the popular mobilization and collective organization, so that in Colombia we could have the first progressive government that could put in the center the agendas of the social movements. And even though the pathway has not been easy, and of course this government has not been exempt of contradictions, some sectors have had great alignment regarding the agendas, the popular agendas and the social movement agendas, which has meant very important advancements in public policy. This is the case of for example, popular environmental agenda, where the debates of phasing out of fossil fuels and the building of sustainable societies has been at the core of the public policy. And the fact that this social movement has proposed for many, many years the necessity of an environmental revolution that builds an economic logic that protects life and gets us out of the country of this economic and colonial system. The fact that we have been heard by the government, the fact that they have respected our wishes, is something to highlight. I would like to say that the conference is one of those steps that we have achieved, and one of these concrete actions where this progressive government has aligned with the demand of social movements and global and national voices that have been demanding to take climate actions. And I think this is an alignment because it's important for us to recognize from civil society that this is an agenda that organizations have been having for many, many years, for decades even. And the fact that a government such as Gustavo Petros and Francia Marquez governments has pushed for this agenda, committing with the social movement, is something to highlight. And this has allowed us to participate directly in this initiative. I also want to mention that the conference, the people that are going to come to Colombia are going to come to Santa Marta, which is a city with great symbolism for the Caribbean because it is a home to the highest coastal mountain range in South America, but it's also an area that has a very specific and great importance to four indigenous peoples in the world. This Sierra Nevada is known as the heart of the world and has a geostrategical importance and a nature importance that is unique to our country. This area, unfortunately, for many years now, has been impacted by mining and energetic extraction. There's a coal port that receives the coal that is exploited in the Cesar area in Colombia. And it has, of course, as it is an ocean port, it has created a lot of pollution regarding the transportation of coal. This is a very important area. And that is why it was the city that was chosen to hold civil society and the governments who are interested in creating actual solutions. I'm going to be talking about the Colombian political scenario, and I think that many Colombian people are here, many Colombian organizations are here, and we are in a very singular Colombian political horizon. This is an electoral year in Colombia. We had the parliamentary elections where the current government received the most votes for senators in history. It does not mean that we have a majority, but it does mean the possibility of more governance for a progressive government. But for the last 4 years that we have been in government, we have seen the difficulty and the challenges of not having a majority in the Congress. And this is probably going to be one of the challenges at future. But right now we're facing presidential elections that are going to happen in May with a candidate that probably many of you know, Ivan Cepeda. He's the candidate of the current government political party. He's the progressive candidate, the only left wing candidate facing other candidates that are fundamentally in the whole spectrum of the right wing that is fragmented but is still powerful. We have seen in the last few days this far rights have been reacting to the proposals towards the need to phase out fossil fuels. They have been reacting very negatively, and there's a big debate surrounding the exploitation of non-conventional yields, and this has been central core in the debates. And it shows us two different pathways as to the society that we want to have as a Colombian society. And it's important to mention that even though we have faced challenges and the fact that all of the progressive governments have faced challenges, we need to recognize that the current government has been working in a transformative agenda with important transformations, with important reforms regarding water, pensions, work. In this government, the environmental agenda has been strategic, part of the core public policy, and with that, the agenda of energetic transition. And Colombia has had an important role, not only producing public policy that wants to lead the country to a transition, but also to place in the table of the multilateral debate issues such as the phasing out of fossil fuels, and also the necessity to create an architecture, a legal architecture, and a multilateral architecture that can help us as a whole world to understand the discussion of energetic transition as a complex discussion that has sociocultural components and that also needs to have a territorial perspective, but that is also very important and urgent. And this is key to have real opportunities and real solutions from a territorial approach that actually responds to the necessity of the territories that have been affected by extractivism. I will be closing, but I want to say that the role of civil society in all the development of the conference has been core. I always say that civil society is having these long-winded jobs. This conference is a milestone in all of the work that we have been doing. This is an opportunity to build alternatives and ways of managing common goods in a communitary way and in a fair way. As civil society, we have participated in the event of the People's Summit. Many people from different places have participated. People from DCJ can have been coordinating participation, methodology, the importance of holding diversity in these spaces, the possibility to speak in our own languages, with our own dialects, and our own ways of thinking as to how to exit fossil fuels and how to build actual solutions for the climate crisis. And in that sense, many people from civil society, in the Colombian case, in the Permanent Council, we have held a lot of territorial workshops so that the territories can also participate actively in the conference, and so that these solutions and transitions that have been happening in the territories, that have been building from the popular movement, can be held in spaces like this. And I again want to say that this conference is a milestone. It's not a starting point. And the question is, how can we keep building together these horizons and these proposals, these key proposals that are not only held in the three lines that the government has worked, which are the lines that have been proposed to work in the conference, but we have other proposals that we have been developing. So to be able to find each other and to move forward in these proposals, the truth is that we have had needs as to how to generate binding participations. We come from multilateral spaces where civil society meets in one place and high-level politicians meet in other places, and the proposals of civil society are just left there. And we have insisted on the need, I think this is an opportunity and a challenge in the conference, is to have a binding participation and an effective participation of civil society in the fact that this can create actual transformations in the government agendas. Understanding also that this is not going to be a debate only of high-level officers, but also civil society. From civil society, we have been pushing and pushing to achieve real solutions and not false solutions that do not change the root of the climate crisis and the importance for the debate, both in the fossil technocracy and in the transition, for us to have real debates, for us to have real actions that can be achievable and can be done in a short time. And we hope that the people that are participating in this webinar and also the people who are here will participate in the conference, understanding that there's a lot to do forward. There's a lot of pressure towards an initiative such as a treaty to be consolidated and to guarantee, as our minister was mentioning, she has insisted that this is the moment to make decisions. This is the moment to meet each other, those who are convinced, the countries who are convinced that this is the pathway. And it's important for us as civil society that we can pressure the countries that are also not convinced, because maybe they are the most at fault for the crisis that we're living. And they need to face their responsibility. They need to have accountability. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kata. Thank you for that wonderful, wonderful, and important reminder that is civil society that's really needed to make sure that this gets pushed, that this is something that we can celebrate already as a victory and that we need to keep going, keep building momentum at this conference and beyond. I know we have a lot of questions, so there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, so please feel free to write your questions there, and we will be answering some of them as we go, but also answering some of them at the end of the webinar. Next, we have Alex.
Thank you so much, Mitzi, and gracias, Catalina. I will speak in English, but I want to thank Catalina for that amazing introduction and to bring us all into the context of Colombia, my adopted home, and also Sensat as an agent for change and social struggle in Colombia has been so important in centering a post-extractivist vision and resisting fossil fuel extraction with allies in Colombia. And they were one of the first organizations to advocate for the fossil fuel treaty in Colombia, leading to Colombia's endorsement. So what is the fossil fuel treaty? We might go to the next slide. Why do we exist? We exist because the Paris Agreement doesn't mention fossil fuels once. Coal, oil, and gas, the words do not appear. The international negotiations and international cooperation on climate have historically focused on emissions, the end of the line, combustion, which is incredibly important, and we need to be reducing our consumption and combustion of fossil fuels. But if we are going to grapple with the crisis, and the climate crisis and the ecological crisis, like Catalina said, is a fossil fuel driven crisis, then we also need to cut with the other side of the scissors. We also need to address the supply of fossil fuels, because we cannot rely on a market neoliberal logic that if we simply send a signal that there will be less demand, there will automatically be less supply. Fossil fuels and the fossil fuel industry are some of the most entrenched and powerful political actors in geopolitics. We are seeing that very, very sadly with the illegal actions of the United States and Israel recently. And so we need to come to an agreement to address fossil fuel supply internationally. And that we need to do that for climate reasons, but we also need to do that to ensure a just socioeconomic transition. Without a change to international rules, many countries across the South will not be able to plan, engage, and implement a fossil fuel transition. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see some of this logic. These are countries organized by income. So the higher you are on the graph, the higher your gross national income. And per capita. And then it is organized by a dependency assessment, which this was done by colleagues and experts through the Civil Society Equity Review, who looked at what percentage of national budgets came from fossil fuel income, so rents, royalties, dividends from national oil companies, and also what percentage of labor force share was based in fossil fuel industries. And then gave us a score. And so the further you are across, the deeper your dependency on the fossil fuel industry and the structure of your national economy. And the proposal that was made by the Civil Society Equity Review was, if we set a clear limit on fossil fuel extraction to align it with the 1.5-degree goal, then we could allocate kind of phase out years based on your dependence. And you could see that there are states like Angola or South Sudan or Iraq or Equatorial Guinea who would need much more time to be able to manage a phase out versus those that have lower dependence on fossil fuel extraction, like China, like Italy, like Norway. But that also there's a set of countries that have per capita income which is much higher than the rest of the world and in line with a high level of human development, and that those states should also be making contributions to ensure a fair phase out. But there are no mechanisms in the international system that even begin any conversation like this. And so that's been one of the real drivers for the call for a fossil fuel treaty. That call has been made for 5 years now by the organizations on this call, by mayors and governors, by leaders of indigenous nations, by trade unions, by faith leaders, by the European Parliament, by IUCN, by the World Health Organization. And so that call has now been taken up by 18 countries who are participating in discussions on what could a fossil fuel treaty look like and how could we advance towards it. And in those discussions, one of the things that the countries discussed was the challenges of bringing up this issue inside the COP of the climate process, the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, because of its procedural process of requiring consensus. It's extremely difficult to bring new complex issues, and specifically the fossil fuel issue has been intentionally blocked by countries over a long period of time. And recognition of the issue of the need to transition away from fossil fuels occurred for the first time at COP28 in Dubai, but the language was technically about the need to transition away only in energy systems, and it doesn't require specific obligations on states, and it doesn't move the conversation towards discussion of mechanisms. And so the countries participating in the discussions on the fossil fuel treaty talked about how could we elevate this issue into the international system. And there were broadly two ways that were considered. One was to continue advancing in the UNFCCC, but also look at other fora where the issue could be advanced, like in a resolution in the UN General Assembly, or in the UNEA, which is the Environment Assembly, where the Plastics Treaty came out. So that was one strand of work. And then the other was trying to catalyze an independent or a new dedicated process to talk about the fossil fuel transition, with the idea that starting a new parallel complementary process would allow the states that are most committed to dealing with this issue to begin conversations in a much more in-depth way that would then allow for the development of better mechanisms and better forms of cooperation. This idea was taken up by the Colombian government and then by the Dutch government. And they, so on the next slide, they announced the conference on the transition away from fossil fuels. And this is the first international conference on the transition away from fossil fuels. This conference is being hosted by the governments of Colombia and the Netherlands. It is much broader than just talking about the fossil fuel treaty. It's not being hosted by the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative, but we see it as a really important catalyst for a conversation about what is missing in international governance when it comes to the transition away from fossil fuels, and what are the opportunities to develop and advance that. So the conference is being led, as I said, by the two host governments. I think there are a lot of important words in the title, but one of them that's very important is first. So this is the first conference, which means it has, as I said, a broad kind of agenda. It's trying to generate a broad set of discussions and conversations. It's trying to generate a broad set of inputs to really be the first time that we bring together all of the different pieces of what the transition away from fossil fuels requires. But also because it's the first, there will be a second. So the intention is that the conversations can continue. And Tuvalu, on behalf of the Pacific Small Island states, has said that they intend to step up and host and convene a second conference. And so the outcomes of this conference in Santa Marta, we hope will create some really, really high ambition, visionary proposals that, for example, should impact and be taken up in the Brazil government's roadmap process that they're convening through the COP. It should develop ideas that could be taken up in different settings. We don't know where yet, but there might be some really useful practical ideas that governments might take on themselves because they have the discussion in Santa Marta, or they might take it up in the UN tax forum negotiation. And we think that it should generate a series of ideas and proposals to be discussed further in a second conference. And that's what we'll be advocating for. The next slide. So the agenda for the conference has 3 pillars, as has been communicated by the hosts, Colombia and the Netherlands. The first pillar is overcoming economic dependence. So going back to what I talked about, the different state of different countries in the international system, for those that have a fiscal dependence, there's a large share of national income comes from the fossil fuel system. How do we actually plan for economic transformation, transition, and so on? I think there was a study by ActionAid last year that showed that just 3% of all climate finance was directed at the question of transition and transition finance. And so there's a real need for international policy making on overcoming fiscal dependence and the debt issue, which often exacerbates plans on fossil fuel extraction. The second is transforming supply and demand. And as I said at the top, it's essential that we address demand for fossil fuels and that we implement policies that effectively drive fuel switching, can manage energy security and access, but that also we need to consider the supply side. And in light of the International Court of Justice's decision, which makes clear that states have obligations to address their plans for subsidies, exploration, and licensing of fossil fuels, the question of what does fossil fuel supply policy look like in 2026 is very important. And also there will be a discussion about what are the incentives that are currently in place that drive both supply and demand. And that's where a question of fossil fuel subsidies will come up. And then you can see the big red arrow. The third pillar of the discussions is how do we advance international cooperation and climate diplomacy, including how do we close gaps in implementation, governance, and cooperation. And that is a part of the agenda where we think there's a really unique opportunity to have a discussion about a fossil fuel treaty. It is clearly an issue that represents a gap in the international system in terms of there is a gap in governance of fossil fuel supply, fossil fuel extraction questions. It's something that has been challenging given the scope and mandate of the UNFCCC. And so that is a place where we think there's an opportunity for all of us as participants in the discussions prior, but also for the governments attending to have an open and frank conversation about what is this gap, what are ways of closing it, how could the treaty be taken up. And in our perspective, of course, we are the initiative calling for a fossil fuel treaty, is that the treaty is one of the unique solutions that really speaks to the agenda as it's structured. And so for that reason, we know that there are many, many issues in the fossil fuel transition. And we know that all of you are doing what you can to tackle those issues. And we're calling on you to recognize this unique opportunity to make a call for the fossil fuel treaty. You're not always calling for the fossil fuel treaty. We understand that the fossil fuel treaty is not a silver bullet that is going to solve all of the things, but the Santa Marta conference with an agenda item on what are the gaps in implementation and governance on the transition away from fossil fuels is really uniquely placed to have the highest level and the broadest consideration yet of the idea of the fossil fuel treaty. And then just to close, also to note in that item, there will also be the discussion of legal barriers to fossil fuel transition, such as the investor state dispute settlement. And it will be important to also advance ideas on that. And addressing ISDS is something that many in the fossil fuel treaty network have been calling for, and something that many of us would like to see considered in the development of a treaty itself.
Thank you so much, Alex. So important. Thank you for reminding us why we're even talking about the treaty, why it's so important, why it's a critical opportunity to advance the treaty, and all the different ways that we need to be looking at the just transition away from the fossil fuel industry, and not just from the energy industry, but also the economic side. So thank you so much for that. And next up, as a reminder, if you want to ask questions, there should be a button at the bottom of your screen that says Q&A that will allow you to ask some questions, and some of them are already being answered, and the others we will try to answer at the end of this call. So our last speaker for today is Andres, who will be talking about how to navigate the conference and other engagement opportunities.
Thank you so much, Mitzi. Greetings to all and a welcome, as we have done. Welcome to Colombia, to Santa Marta, to this historic conference that, thanks to the effort of everyone here, we managed to happen. This is the first time that we're going to be sitting more than 50 countries to talk about fossil fuels and to talk about the core issue for a climate crisis. And this is something that we have achieved working together. The interventions, the point of Catalina and Alex were very clear. We need to move forward also in Santa Marta and try to arrive to a clear mandate for a treaty against fossil fuels, understanding it as a tool that is not going to be the solution, but is one of the closest things to the buildings that we have been doing from this social movement for economic justice and climate justice. In that sense, I'm going to talk about the process of the Colombian government. We have articulated with the Permanent Council for Just Transition to move forward and put our perspectives in the agenda so that this can be useful and discussed by the more of 50 countries that are going to be in Santa Marta. This is the structure that the Colombian government proposed that tends to be more inclusive. We want to remind everyone that there was a registration process. The government called this the funnel methodology. There were more than 2,000 organizations that registered. They were invited to contribute with written inputs throughout the process. These written contributions were received up until March 14th. Afterwards, the government, with these contributions, published a technical syntheses. Then they proposed virtual dialogues per chapters, per sectors. These virtual dialogues that had a lot of participation. It was a point to fine-tune the perspectives from civil society, from the different sectors of civil society that will be coming to Santa Marta. And afterwards, what was built was this preliminary position papers per sector that are going to go to an in-person coordination event that are going to happen from the 24th towards the 27th, prior to the high-level conversations. There's a great variety of proposals from different sectors of civil society talking about the specific issues. They have come together to generate inputs for a very special space that is going to center our advocacy. And this is the space of the People's Summit for a Future Free of Fossil Fuels. This space that is being coordinated by the Permanent Council, and Catalina from Sensat have been participating. I want to highlight the participation from Amarilis Llano and Catalina to build this possibility. And the fact that Ali from DCJ and ISICAN have come to this space where we can put together roadmaps and inputs that are going to be integrated to the official discussions. This discussion is going to happen on Monday, April 27th, where more than 200 people are going to be participating. In this meeting of 250 people, 2 people are going to be selected. 1 people who will be speaking, 1 people who will be accompanying for the high-level sector. These people are going to have the great responsibility to bring the discussions, the perspectives, and the inputs from the different sectors so that they can inform the high-level discussions. We need to distinguish that there are no there is a need to distinguish the participation with what we have seen before, which is, for example, the discussions on the UNCCC COP, where the civil society were the last option to participate. So I think it's very important to have this participation, and we need to insist that it's fundamental to bring this proposal for a treaty from different sectors so it can be positioned in the high-level discussion and so that it can counteract with the intentions of other countries that might not want to recognize their historical responsibility in accumulating capital and throughout this capitalist fossil fuel industry. And this might be the first document that generates and that brings together all of the perspectives of the enabling conditions towards a phase out of the fossil fuels. That has been the funnel methodology of the government. And I would like to mention, next slide. I would like to mention here in general what is going to be the official program. 24th and 25th, we're going to have the academic dialogue and part of the dialogues from civil society, also from unions, religious sectors, all of the sectors that are going to be there. On the 26th, we're going to have the parliamentary chapter, also the Assembly of the Peoples. On the 27th, we're going to have this subnational government dialogue. Indigenous peoples are going to be a part. And on the 28th and 29th, the high-level segment. Next slide. We hope to have visibility soon, and you're going to be able to check that out on the webpage of the treaty so that we can understand all of the spaces that are going to happen in Santa Marta. So I thank you for being here. I want to invite you to visit this webpage, next slide, so that we can all understand and so that we can all come together in this demands towards the first historical conference phasing out of fossil fuels. We leave you this video here where you can see our webpage, the page of the summit, and where we can have all of the information towards Santa Marta. I don't know. Oh, you can see it. Great. So, a very important event that I want to highlight is that those who are not going to be on the 20th or 28th 29th in the high-level segment can come to the Treaty House. We're going to try to have a continuation of the articulation of the different networks. Both days, we're going to have the opportunity to have a live broadcast of the high-level segment and to keep building together these strategies from the global climate movement so that we can achieve a fair and equitable phasing out of fossil fuels. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andres, for that really comprehensive and useful information that you shared. And now we will be looking at some of the questions. We have one question that says, how do you assess the contribution so far of the Dutch government as co-organizer of the conference? Constructive, less ambitious than Colombia, or same? From Larry Moffett. Would any of our speakers like to answer this one?
Thank you, Larry. I mean, I think the Dutch government stepped into a leadership role and opportunity here, and they have stepped up to try and ensure that the conference has happened. We don't have a lot of visibility on what they might be doing or not behind the scenes. We know that many European countries express concerns about the idea of a fossil fuel treaty, and they express those concerns for various reasons. Often the stated reason is they worry about competition with the Paris Agreement. I think many of our European members of this network would suggest that also they're concerned about a treaty focusing on equity is going to create clear and specific obligations on European countries due to their historic responsibility, and that's challenging for many of those governments. Check.
Thank you, Alex. And if people have a question generally about accreditations and processes of the conference itself, we encourage you to contact the hosts in Colombia and the Dutch government about those. We have another question from Nick De Carlo. As I understand it, there are a number of oil-producing countries like Canada that are attending the conference. How do you see their role and influence on the conference?
I can try to answer that, Mitzi. I think it's important that we understand this as a first historical conference. This is a first step towards an open and broad discussion regarding phasing out of fossil fuels and the different conditions of each country. This has not been achievable through 30 COPs, in the process of the UNCCC up until the 20th. So we need to understand that there are conditions for producing countries and from countries that depend on them. There are global conditions, and we cannot ignore the current geopolitical situations that have the barrel up until 100, a value of 100 USD. So this is the conversations that we need to have so that we can build pathways that are solid, that are achievable, and that can lead us to a mandate. And how can we understand these perspectives? I would like to highlight here as a last point the input that we generated from the initiative of the treaty, and to talk about the sellers and the buyers that have been in different treaties and how we need to establish in a short period of time, while we can phase out, we need to create market structures that can favor the countries that are part of this agreement and that can in some way hop over these conditions of the market and the geopolitical conditions that we are currently facing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andres. It's such an important question to ask, as we know that we want to really ensure that we have a just transition away from fossil fuels. We now have a question from Thomas Finger, and maybe Kata, you can answer this one. Considering recent events from the United States that breaking the international sovereignty rights of southern nations, how can we proceed in the fight for a just transition where international law and collaboration is undermined by direct bellic power? Speaking of that in a way where organizations and civil society actors feel undermined and with fright of being threatened by the potent oil industry.
This is a question that we might want to answer in the conference together. What I would say from the social movement that I come from is that international solidarity, the work of the peoples, the gathering between the peoples working together, and the possibility to put the agendas that we have been working on for so many years. I always insist that transition is something that has been happening in the territories. So facing multilateralism that is just crumbling, what I think is we need to ask ourselves where the solutions are coming from. What we find in these multilateral spaces are opportunities for dialogue, but the solutions come from the territorial work, the possibilities that the peoples have to build alliances, to build solidarity. What I would say is that facing this complex moment, because it's not only a geopolitical complex context, but this strengthening of the imperial logic that is currently reigning in the world. This context gives us the moment or the opportunity for all of these ways of living, ways of seeing the world can save us. I think this is a very difficult question, but what I would say is that we need to keep steady in this long-winded struggle. I think that can be very interesting, not losing the capacity and the ability to face and of coming together to build hope.
Thank you so much, Kata.
I think that's key.
Sorry. Thank you so much, Kata. I really, really appreciate your answer. And it is so true. When we've seen world leaders and politicians just go astray and not actually do their job of serving the people, it has been marginalized communities, it has been indigenous communities, it has been grassroots people on the ground who have really led change. And what reminds me of this moment and what inspires me and gives me hope is looking at previous victories in the past. We've seen the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, we've seen the Landmines Treaty, previous treaties that were also something that was brought forward by civil society, by the people most marginalized, pushing governments to form a coalition of the willing. And we're seeing the same pattern here. And hopefully the Fossil Fuel Treaty is the next thing that will really get them to come together again. And we'll have one last question from Martin, and maybe Alex, you can take this one. What do you see as a realistic outcome from the conference towards a treaty? Which elements in the outcome document? What should we lobby within Western countries? And thanks for the hint on equity challenges for Western countries.
No, thanks, Missy, and thanks everybody for the great questions and conversation. So I think the outcomes that we're looking for is that across the different dialogues and spaces, there's a clear articulation of the problem, that there is a gap in global governance on the question of fossil fuel supply, and that there's a proposal to be considered, the idea of a fossil fuel treaty. And so we encourage, as I said, allies and members of this network to be advocating for that, so that the underlying report and documents demonstrate that there is this clear problem and this proposed solution. We also are optimistic that given many of the countries and governments represented in the room have joined in calling for a fossil fuel treaty, that there will be a discussion amongst the government representatives in the high-level segment about the logic of a fossil fuel treaty, the gap it is trying to fill, and what it could or should include. and that this conversation is generative and creates a space for a further, more deeper conversation amongst new and different governments that are now interested in pursuing the idea. And so I think we're asking all governments to give time and space for the discussion. The Santa Marta conference is not a negotiating forum. There's not a negotiated outcome. So what's important is that ideas are given the space for a conversation and discussion so there can be better understanding of the real problem and the real opportunities for the solution. And I think, in addition, the members of the group that are discussing the proposed treaty will be meeting on the sidelines, independently to discuss further ideas about what a treaty could look like. And so there may be some sharing further about what it looks like to have a fossil fuel treaty. And I also hope that the discussions across all three pillars can inform what a fossil fuel treaty could or should do. There will be many ideas and proposals, and those could be taken up in the subsequent discussions about what a fossil fuel treaty could and should look like.
Thank you so much, Alex, and thank you everyone for coming to this webinar. Again, if you need more information, please look at the websites that we've sent and Andres has already showed earlier. And see you all next week in Santa Marta. And if you're not going to Santa Marta, see you on the streets or wherever campaigning and pushing for a fossil fuel treaty and a just transition. Thank you, everyone. Bye.